Imagine a stormy night on Route 66. Jack Tanner, a veteran truck driver, is on a routine haul, braving the rain-soaked roads that cut through America's empty heartland. He's used to long, lonely nights on the highway, but tonight feels different, unnervingly so. As thunder rumbles and lightning flashes across the bleak landscape, Jack's radio crackles to life with a chilling message. "Don't stop. For her." Startled, he tries to shake it off as static from the storm. But the warning stays with him, even as he spots a lone figure up ahead, a young woman, drenched and still, waiting in the rain. Who is she? And why is she there, on this desolate road, in the middle of the night? Jack decides to help, but as he continues down the dark, twisting road with his silent passenger, he realizes this isn't just another haul. Dark secrets and eerie revelations await him, and soon he'll confront a past he thought he'd left behind. Stay with us as we dive into the Midnight Haul, a tale of suspense, guilt, and a journey that might never find its end. The first story, the Midnight Haul. Jack Tanner had been driving trucks across the United States for over 2 decades. Roads had become his second home, and the loneliness of the highway was something he was accustomed to, even embraced. He'd seen all kinds of strange things on these late-night routes, but nothing that had ever rattled him, not until tonight. It was supposed to be a routine haul, take the shipment from Oklahoma to New Mexico, a straight shot that would have him driving through some of the country's most desolate stretches. Jack didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he enjoyed it. It gave him time to think, to process the weight of his life, to reflect on the endless nights he spent behind the wheel. But as he set out that evening, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. The weather was worsening. Thunder rolled across the plains, and lightning flashed in bursts that illuminated the bleak, empty landscape. Rain began to fall in a heavy sheet, quickly turning the road into a slick, shimmering ribbon beneath his headlights. Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, peering through the downpour, his wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. The truck radio crackled to life suddenly, startling him. He hadn't turned it on. Static filled the cab, broken only by brief, garbled fragments of speech that he couldn't quite make out. He fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear signal, but all he heard was a faint, almost ghostly whisper before the static returned. "Don't stop. For her." Jack froze, the whisper lingering in his mind like a warning, but he quickly brushed it off, attributing it to the storm. After all, he'd driven through worse weather before, and strange radio signals were part of the territory on long hauls. He laughed nervously and muttered, "You're letting your imagination get the best of you, old man." As he continued down the highway, he became aware of a strange, nagging feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced at his mirrors but saw nothing but the empty road behind him. Still, the sensation persisted, a prickle at the back of his neck that wouldn't go away. About an hour later, as he was driving through a particularly deserted stretch of road, Jack noticed something up ahead. A figure standing by the roadside, illuminated by his headlights. It was a young woman, soaked from head to toe, her hair hanging limply over her face. She stood perfectly still, staring down at the ground as though she was lost in thought. Jack's first instinct was to keep driving. Something about her seemed wrong. But as he drew closer, he saw her shivering in the rain, looking vulnerable and desperate. He felt a pang of guilt. He'd been raised better than to leave someone stranded in the middle of a storm. He pulled over, rolling down the window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't look up at first, but slowly she lifted her head, meeting his gaze with eyes that were disturbingly vacant. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Jack hesitated, feeling a chill creep over him, but he dismissed it as nerves. "Need a lift?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice came out shakier than he intended. She nodded slowly, walking around to the passenger side and climbing in without a word. Jack noticed that she was clutching something in her hand, a small, battered locket, but he didn't mention it. The air inside the cab grew noticeably colder as she settled into the seat, her silence filling the space like a tangible weight. "Where are you headed?" Jack asked, trying to break the silence. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she replied in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Just away from here." Something about the way she said it made Jack's skin crawl. He focused on the road, trying to ignore the growing unease in his stomach. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, though the clock on the dashboard told him it had only been about 30 minutes. Jack kept stealing glances at her out of the corner of his eye, but she just stared straight ahead, clutching the locket tightly in her hand. Eventually, he couldn't take the silence anymore. "So, you got family around here?" he asked, trying to make conversation. Her response was chillingly vague. "I used to." Jack cleared his throat, deciding not to push any further. The radio crackled to life again, filling the cab with static. But this time, Jack didn't reach for the dial. Instead, he let it play, hoping that maybe the interference would pass on its own. Suddenly, a voice cut through the static, clearer than before. "Jack, turn back." He stared at the radio, his pulse quickening. It wasn't possible. Nobody knew he'd picked up this hitchhiker. Nobody knew he was even out here. He glanced at the woman beside him, but she was still staring straight ahead, as if she hadn't heard a thing. Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely steady. She finally looked at him, her eyes dark and hollow. "Hear what?" He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Nothing. Must be the storm messing with the radio." She didn't respond, just turned back to the road, her expression unreadable. Jack's mind raced. He was beginning to regret picking her up, but he couldn't just kick her out in the middle of nowhere. As they continued down the highway, the landscape grew stranger. Jack couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off, as though the road itself had changed. The trees on either side of the highway seemed to stretch toward them, their branches twisting into shapes that looked disturbingly like skeletal hands. After another long stretch of silence, Jack finally asked, "What's with the locket?" For the first time, the woman seemed genuinely startled. She looked down at the locket in her hand, her fingers tightening around it protectively. "It's all I have left of him." "Him?" Jack prompted, sensing that there was more to the story. She hesitated, her gaze shifting to the rain-soaked window. "He was taken from me a long time ago." Jack didn't know what to say. There was a sadness in her voice, a deep, lingering grief that he could feel in his bones. He almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then, as he glanced at her, he noticed something strange. Her reflection in the window didn't quite match her movements. While she sat still, her reflection seemed to shift, its eyes narrowing, its mouth twisting into a faint, malicious smile. Jack's heart pounded, and he quickly looked away, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "So, where exactly am I taking you?" She didn't answer. Instead, the radio crackled again, and this time the voice was unmistakable. "Turn back, Jack. She's not what she seems." Jack's hands were clammy on the wheel. He stole another glance at the woman, but her expression remained impassive. He was beginning to wonder if he was losing his mind, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman spoke. "We're close now." Jack frowned, glancing at the empty, featureless landscape outside. "Close to what?" "To where it happened," she replied, her voice soft, almost mournful. "The place where he was taken from me." Jack's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he didn't want to believe it. He glanced at her hands, at the way she clutched the locket, as though it were her lifeline. Who are you?" She turned to him, her face shifting in the dim light, her features blurring and twisting. For a brief moment, Jack thought he saw something monstrous, something ancient and full of hate. "I was left behind," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Left to wander these roads, looking for the one who didn't stop, the one who didn't save him." Jack's heart thundered in his chest as he remembered. Years ago, he'd driven this same route, on a night just like this one. He'd seen a car broken down on the side of the road, a man and a woman waving for help. But he'd kept driving, telling himself he couldn't take any risks. And now, here she was, sitting beside him, her presence a cold reminder of his past sins. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know." But her face contorted with rage, her eyes glowing with a cold, unearthly light. "It's too late for apologies, Jack." The truck lurched forward, the engine roaring as though possessed. Jack struggled with the steering wheel, but it was no use. The truck barreled down the highway, the headlights illuminating a twisted, desolate landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. Jack's mind was racing, memories surfacing in fragmented, painful bursts. He could remember the night, the same endless rain, the dark stretch of road, the headlights cutting through the gloom as he drove on without looking back. That was years ago, and he'd buried the memory deep, telling himself it was just another night on the road, nothing more. But now, as he glanced at the woman beside him, no longer just a figure, but a manifestation of his guilt and fear, he realized he'd never really forgotten. Why are you doing this?" Jack stammered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The woman didn't answer immediately, and he could feel her gaze, cold and penetrating, as if she were looking straight into his soul. "You know why," she said finally, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate within the cab. "You left us there. You left him." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He swallowed, a wave of nausea washing over him. "I was scared," he admitted, the confession tasting bitter in his mouth. "I didn't know what would happen. I thought someone else would help." Her expression hardened, her eyes gleaming with a fury that sent chills down his spine. "Someone else?" she echoed, her voice dripping with contempt. "You passed us by like we were nothing, like we didn't matter." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense, no justification. He knew deep down that he'd made a selfish choice, one he'd tried to rationalize ever since. But here, now under her gaze, he couldn't hide from the truth. The landscape outside the truck had changed entirely. The familiar landmarks, the stretches of open road, and even the distant lights of the highway had all disappeared, replaced by a dense, twisted forest that seemed to close in around them. The trees loomed tall and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers clawing at the truck. Jack's heart pounded as he realized that this wasn't just a hallucination or a trick of the mind. Somehow the road itself had transformed, taking him somewhere he didn't recognize, somewhere far from the world he knew. "Where are we?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain and howling wind. The woman turned to him, her eyes glinting with a strange, otherworldly light. "This is where we were left. Forgotten. Abandoned." Jack shivered, feeling a chill settle over him. The air in the cab had grown colder, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. It felt as though they were no longer in the world he knew, but in some dark, twisted version of it. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll take you wherever you need to go. I'll help you find peace." The woman's expression softened just for a moment, but then it hardened again. "You think peace is something you can offer, after what you did?" Jack didn't know how to respond. He was trapped, both physically and emotionally, with no escape from the guilt and horror that surrounded him. The road stretched on, winding deeper into the eerie forest. Jack felt like he was descending into some kind of purgatory, a place where he would be forced to confront every mistake he'd ever made. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but every turn only led him further into the darkness. "Tell me," the woman said suddenly, breaking the silence, Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was an intensity in her tone that made Jack's blood run cold. "Do you even remember his face?" Jack hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he'd expected. He tried to recall the man he'd left behind, the figure he'd seen standing in the rain, waving desperately for help. But the memory was hazy, blurred by years of denial and self-justification. I don't," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I remember the night, the rain. But his face, it's gone." The woman's expression twisted, a mixture of anger and sorrow flashing across her features. "You erased him," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Just like you erased us." Jack clenched his fists, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but he knew it would be meaningless. His actions spoke louder than any words he could offer. As they continued down the twisted road, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He knew, deep down, that he was heading towards something he couldn't escape, a reckoning that had been waiting for him all these years. Finally, the truck came to a stop, as if guided by some unseen force. Jack looked around, his heart pounding as he took in his surroundings. They were in a clearing, surrounded by the twisted, skeletal trees. In the center of the clearing was a small, crumbling house, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy and moss. "This is where it happened," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where you left us." Jack stared at the house, a sense of recognition washing over him. He remembered passing by this place, seeing the broken-down car on the side of the road, the figures standing in the rain. He'd felt a twinge of guilt even then, but he'd pushed it aside, telling himself he couldn't stop, that he had to keep moving. I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have helped. I should have done something." The woman's eyes were filled with a cold, unforgiving rage. "Sorry won't bring him back," she said, her voice echoing through the night. "But maybe you can finally understand what it's like to be abandoned." Jack felt a chill settle over him as he realized what she meant. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making him feel the same fear, the same helplessness that he'd caused her to feel. As Jack sat in the truck, paralyzed by guilt and fear, he began to hear voices, whispers that seemed to come from all around him, filling the air with a haunting melody of sorrow and despair. He could feel the presence of others, ghosts of the past who had been left behind, just like the woman beside him. "Help us," the voices murmured, their tone filled with longing and pain. "Why didn't you help us?" Jack covered his ears, but the voices only grew louder, echoing in his mind, each one a reminder of his failure to act, his choice to look the other way. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know it would come to this." But the voices didn't care. They continued to haunt him, their words a relentless reminder of the lives he'd affected, the pain he'd caused. The woman turned to him, her eyes filled with a cold, unforgiving light. "This is your punishment," she said, her voice echoing through the cab. "To walk these roads forever, searching for forgiveness that will never come." Jack's heart pounded as he realized what she meant. He would be trapped here, forced to relive this night over and over, a never-ending journey through the darkness, haunted by the ghosts of his past. "Please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "Give me a chance to make it right. I'll do anything." But the woman's expression remained impassive, her gaze cold and unyielding. "There is no redemption for those who abandon others," she said, her words filled with a chilling finality. As the truck continued down the endless road, Jack felt a wave of despair wash over him. He knew, deep down, that there was no escape, no chance for redemption. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own choices, forever doomed to wander the haunted highways of his past. The road stretched on, twisting and turning, through a landscape that seemed to defy logic and reality. Jack's mind was a blur of memories and regrets, each one a reminder of the choices he'd made, the lives he'd affected. He could see the faces of those he'd left behind, their eyes filled with sorrow and pain, their voices a haunting echo that filled the cab. As he drove, he felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, a crushing force that seemed to drain the life from him. He knew, deep down, that this was his punishment. A never-ending journey through the darkness, a road that would lead him nowhere, a life spent in eternal penance for the choices he'd made. The woman beside him remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her expression cold and unforgiving. She was his companion, his judge, his reminder of the life he'd left behind. And as he drove on, he knew that he would never escape her, never find peace. For Jack Tanner, the road was endless, a twisted, haunted path that stretched into eternity. And as he drove, he could hear the voices of the past, a chorus of sorrow and despair, a reminder of the choices he'd made and the lives he'd affected. In the end, there was no escape, no redemption, only the road, an endless journey through the darkness, a haunting reminder of the past that would never let him go. The storm continued to rage outside, and as Jack glanced into the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The reflection didn't show just the empty road behind him. It showed a line of shadowy figures, their faces pale and empty, walking silently in the rain. They seemed to follow the truck, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions twisted with anger and sorrow. Jack looked back over his shoulder, expecting to see them on the road, but there was nothing there. Only in the mirror could he see them, a ghostly procession that stretched on for miles, each figure a reminder of someone he had left behind, someone he hadn't helped. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut, hoping the figures would disappear when he opened them. But when he looked again, they were still there, closer this time, their eyes filled with accusation. What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman beside him remained silent, her gaze fixed on the road. Jack realized with a sinking feeling that she wouldn't give him any answers. She was only here to guide him deeper into this nightmare, to remind him of his guilt. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a winding path through darkness and fog. Jack's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the eerie reflection in the mirror. He could hear faint whispers in the air, voices that seemed to rise and fall with the rain, filling the cab with a haunting melody of sorrow and regret. And then the whispers turned into screams. They were the screams of people he'd passed by over the years, people he'd ignored or abandoned in moments of selfishness or fear. Their voices filled his mind, each one a painful reminder of the choices he'd made, the lives he'd left behind. He could feel their pain, their anger, their disappointment, and it weighed on him like a physical burden, crushing his spirit. "Stop it!" he shouted, covering his ears, but the screams only grew louder, echoing through the cab, drowning out the sound of the rain. The woman beside him watched him silently, her eyes cold and unfeeling. She didn't care about his suffering, his regret. She was here to make him face his past, to show him the consequences of his actions. "Why are you doing this to me?" he cried, his voice breaking. I was just doing my job." The woman's expression twisted into a grim smile. "And you thought that made it okay to ignore those in need? To pass by without a second thought?" Jack's throat tightened and he felt tears prick his eyes. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd been scared, that he hadn't known what to do. But he knew, deep down, that it was just an excuse. He'd chosen to ignore them, to leave them behind, and now he was paying the price. As the truck continued down the road, Jack saw something up ahead, a graveyard hidden in the fog and rain. The tombstones were old and crumbling, overgrown with ivy and moss, and each one seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that this wasn't just any graveyard. It was a graveyard of the forgotten, a place where the souls of those he'd abandoned had been laid to rest. Each tombstone bore a name, a date, a story, a life that had been cut short by his choices. The woman gestured toward the graveyard, her eyes filled with a dark, knowing look. "These are the ones you left behind, Jack. The ones who were waiting for you, hoping you'd come back for them. But you never did." Jack's hands shook as he brought the truck to a stop, staring at the graveyard in horror. He could see the names on the tombstones, names he vaguely remembered, faces he'd tried to forget. They were all here, waiting for him, their eyes filled with a cold, unforgiving rage. I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I thought someone else would help." The woman shook her head, her expression hardened. "And now you're alone, just like they were." Jack felt a wave of despair wash over him as he realized there was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own choices, his own guilt. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to plead for a second chance, but he knew it was too late. The woman beside him leaned closer, her face inches from his, her eyes filled with a cold, unfeeling darkness. "This is where your journey ends, Jack. This is where you pay for what you've done." She reached out, her hand cold and clammy, and touched his shoulder. Jack felt a jolt of pain, a burning sensation that spread through his body, filling him with a darkness that seemed to seep into his very soul. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with memories of the people he'd left behind, the lives he'd affected. He could feel their pain, their sorrow, their anger, and it was overwhelming, suffocating. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the truck. He was standing in the graveyard, surrounded by the souls of the forgotten, their eyes fixed on him, their faces twisted with rage and sorrow. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." But they didn't care. They closed in on him, their cold hands reaching out, their voices a chorus of despair and accusation. "You left us," they whispered, their voices echoing through the night. "You abandoned us, and now you will join us." Jack felt a wave of terror wash over him as he realized what they meant. He was doomed to wander this road forever, trapped in a never-ending journey through the darkness, a haunting reminder of the lives he'd left behind. As the souls closed in on him, he could feel their cold hands pressing against him, pulling him down, dragging him into the earth. He tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed him, and he felt himself sinking, deeper and deeper, until there was nothing left but the cold, silent void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Jack opened his eyes, gasping for breath, his heart pounding. He was back in his truck, the storm raging outside, the road stretching on before him. He looked around, disoriented, his mind reeling from the nightmare he just experienced. But as he glanced into the rearview mirror, he saw the shadowy figures again, their eyes filled with sorrow and pain. He could feel their presence, their silent accusation, and he knew that he would never be free of them. He was doomed to wander these haunted highways forever, a prisoner of his own guilt, a ghost among the living, forever searching for forgiveness that would never come. And as he drove on into the endless night, he knew that he would never escape the road that had become his prison, his punishment, his eternal haunting. Years passed, and the legend of Jack Tanner, the trucker who disappeared on a stormy night, became a tale told by drivers across the country. They spoke of a phantom truck that haunted the highways, driven by a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. Some said they'd seen him, that he'd appeared in their rearview mirrors, a silent warning to those who dared to ignore the cries of those in need. And on stormy nights when the rain pounded down and the road stretched on into the darkness, Truckers would glance into their mirrors, searching for the ghostly figure who drove the endless road, a reminder of the price of indifference, of the souls left behind. For Jack Tanner, the road was eternal, a winding path through the shadows, forever haunted by the ghosts of his past. And as he drove on, he knew that he would never escape the darkness, never find peace, never find redemption. For some roads have no end. The second story, The Haunting Mile. Tom Williams was a seasoned truck driver with over 30 years on the road. He knew every twist, every shortcut, and every rest stop from Texas to California. Tom thought he'd experienced everything there was to encounter on the open road, from blown-out tires on deserted highways to violent storms that turned his windshield into a wall of rain, and even strange figures flitting past on lonely stretches of road at night. A practical man, Tom didn't believe in ghost stories. To him, those were tales for tourists and children, not something to lose sleep over. He'd never considered that anything from another world could shake him, until he took a late-night haul from Austin, Texas, to Reno, Nevada. That trip changed everything he thought he knew about what lurked in the dark. The night began uneventfully. Tom had loaded up his rig, checked the fuel and equipment, and set out into the night. Overhead, a faint crescent moon cast its light on the inky black road, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, silent and deserted, just the way Tom liked it. The soft hum of country music filled the cab, creating a comfortable atmosphere. Around midnight, Tom decided to stop at a small, isolated gas station in a rundown town he'd never heard of before. The gas station's lights were dim, the paint on the sign peeling, but it was open, and Tom thought he could use a cup of coffee to stay alert for the long drive ahead. As he pumped gas, an old woman shuffled out of the gas station's shadowy doorway. She was small, hunched over, with a worn, frayed shawl draped around her shoulders. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, were fixed on Tom with a gaze so intense that it unsettled him. "You're heading west, aren't you?" she asked, her voice raspy. Tom gave a slight nod, glancing around to see if anyone else was nearby. The gas station was deserted. "Stay away from mile marker 137, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't stop. No matter what you see or hear, don't stop." Tom chuckled, brushing off her words as local superstition. He nodded politely, paid for his coffee, and climbed back into his truck. The old woman's words echoed in his mind as he drove, but he quickly shook them off. Mile markers were just numbers on the side of the road. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. That was stuff for kids and the superstitious. 2 hours later, Tom was driving down a lonely stretch of desert highway. The sky was pitch black, and the only light came from his headlights cutting through the darkness. He hadn't seen another vehicle in hours, and a sense of isolation settled over him like a heavy blanket. He reached over to switch on the radio, hoping for some music to break the silence, but all he got was static. Frowning, he fiddled with the dial, trying to find a station. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper cutting through the static. A voice, soft and nearly inaudible, but he caught a few words. "Don't stop. 137. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He quickly turned off the radio, shaking his head. It had to be a coincidence, he told himself. Probably just interference from the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But the road ahead felt different now. The darkness seemed to close in on him, and strange shapes appeared in the corners of his vision, shadows that vanished as soon as he turned to look. A growing sense of dread clawed at Tom's insides, but he pushed it aside and kept driving. Then he saw her. A woman in a white dress was standing on the side of the road, illuminated by his headlights. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she was looking right at him. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't stop, remembering the old woman's warning, but his gaze stayed fixed on the figure as he passed. As he drove by, he saw her mouth move, forming words he couldn't hear. Her eyes held a desperation that sent chills down his spine. And then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness as though she'd never been there. Tom tried to shake off the encounter, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But when he glanced at the mile marker beside him, his blood ran cold. Tom's heart pounded as he realized he was at mile marker 137. He swallowed down his rising panic, telling himself it was just a coincidence. But at that moment, the truck's engine suddenly died. The headlights flickered and then went out completely, leaving Tom enveloped in darkness. He sat motionless, trying to steady his breathing, but something inside him urged him to look in the rearview mirror. Despite the darkness, he could make out the faint outline of the woman standing behind the truck. A wave of icy fear washed over him. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and he could hear her whisper, a voice like the wind slicing through the cracks of his windows. "Don't leave me here." Tom couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking as he searched for a signal, but the screen only displayed the words, "No service." Desperate, he tried to start the truck again, turning the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't budge. When he looked up, he saw the woman moving closer. She walked toward the truck, one step at a time, as if time itself had slowed down. Fear overwhelmed him, and he pounded his fists on the steering wheel, shouting, "Leave me alone!" But instead of retreating, the woman smiled, a cold, chilling smile. She placed a hand on the truck's door, her eyes locked on his, and spoke in a voice filled with hatred. "You left me here. Now, you must suffer as I did." Suddenly, long-buried memories surged to the surface. Tom remembered another night, many years ago, in a storm much like this one. He had been driving down this exact stretch of road, and he had seen a woman on the roadside, waving desperately. Tired and eager to get home, he hadn't stopped, telling himself that someone else would help her. It had only been a split-second decision, but he now realized the woman haunting him was that same girl. "No, it can't be," Tom muttered, horrified by the bitter realization. He had left her to die, abandoning her on the road that night. And now she had come back to make him pay. Her whispers grew louder, echoing in his mind like a relentless nightmare. She repeated her words, her voice laced with hatred and despair. "You left me here. Now you'll never leave." Tom tried the ignition once more, twisting the key in a desperate attempt. Suddenly, the engine roared to life and the headlights illuminated the road ahead. Not wasting a second, Tom hit the gas, the truck roaring down the road, leaving the woman's figure fading in his rearview mirror. But Tom's relief was short-lived. He heard a tapping on the truck's windows, a faint sound at first, like rain, but growing louder, as if someone was knocking on the glass. When he glanced out the window, he saw the woman's face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes staring directly at him. Terrified, Tom faced forward, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. But the tapping continued, insistent and relentless, accompanied by her chilling whisper that echoed through the cab. "You can't escape. Don't leave me here alone." Tom floored the gas, desperately trying to escape her grip, but the woman's figure appeared in every window, every reflection. She was everywhere, surrounding him in a living nightmare, trapping him within the walls of his own truck. He tried to focus on the road, pushing the truck to its limit, hoping to escape mile marker 137. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, like he was caught in an endless loop. Her whispers filled his mind, blurring the lines between reality and terror. Tom began to understand that the only way to escape her curse was to drive past mile marker 137 without stopping. He remembered the old woman's warning at the gas station and fought to stay resolute, refusing to look at the ghostly woman or listen to her whispers in his ear. The fear was nearly unbearable. The darkness seemed to close in around him, pulling him into a bottomless void. Tom closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and focused solely on the road ahead. He pressed the gas pedal harder, determined to escape this cursed stretch of highway. As his truck finally sped past mile marker 138, the tapping and whispers faded into silence. Tom opened his eyes, looking into the rearview mirror, and saw that the woman was gone. The road ahead was brighter, and for the first time he felt free. Tom stopped at a rest area a few miles down the road, gasping as though he'd just escaped a nightmare. He sat in his truck, feeling his heartbeat slowly return to normal. But when he looked down at the steering wheel, he noticed a wet handprint, cold and clammy, the mark of the woman he had abandoned years ago. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and he heard the voice of the old woman from the gas station. Every abandoned soul needs someone. Once you cross that line, there's no turning back. Tom stared at the handprint, his chest tightening with dread. He realized that, even though he had escaped mile marker 137, he was still haunted by her presence. And from that night on, every time he drove down a deserted road, he felt a cold, ghostly presence beside him, reminding him of that fateful decision on a stormy night long ago.
Story 3. The Haunting on Route 66.
The roads were empty, the sky above a roiling mass of storm clouds that crackled with flashes of lightning. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the dark stretch of Route 66 before him. He'd been driving trucks for over 2 decades and thought he'd seen it all. Every winding road, shortcut, and eerie stretch of highway from the Midwest to the West Coast was familiar territory. But tonight felt different. A last-minute haul had forced him to drive across a route he usually avoided at night. People talked about this stretch of Route 66 as if it were cursed, a road to drive only during the day. Yet here he was, and as the rain began to fall in thick sheets, the familiar comfort of the road slipped away. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and his headlights barely cut through the darkness. Shadows danced along the roadside, and the sparse trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches stretching and morphing in the storm. His usual confidence was replaced by an uncharacteristic sense of dread. He flipped on the radio, hoping to drown out the unsettling quiet, but all he heard was static. The air was thick with something he couldn't name, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Jack tried to shake it off. Just nerves, he told himself. It was late, the weather was bad, and he was running on caffeine and fumes. Nothing more. An hour into his drive, something caught his eye. On the shoulder of the road, barely visible through the rain, stood a lone figure. Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, her thin figure silhouetted against the storm. She was drenched, her dark hair plastered against her face, her clothes clinging to her frame. She didn't move, didn't wave him down, just stood there, staring blankly ahead. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to leave her behind. But the image of her, soaked and vulnerable, tugged at something inside him. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down the passenger window. "Are you okay?" he called out, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. The woman didn't respond. She just looked at him, her eyes hollow and distant, as if she weren't fully there. Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but shook it off. Maybe she was in shock, lost, or disoriented. "Get in," he said, unlocking the door. "I'll give you a lift to the nearest town." She climbed in slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical, as though her limbs were made of lead. Once seated, she pulled her legs up onto the seat, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, her expression vacant. Jack forced a polite smile, though it felt strained. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared into the darkness, her eyes unblinking. After a long silence, she finally murmured, "Anywhere but here." He chuckled nervously, hoping to lighten the mood. "Yeah, I get that. The weather's not helping, is it?" She didn't react. Her face remained impassive, pale, almost translucent under the dim light of the dashboard. Jack felt a pang of discomfort, but reminded himself that she was probably just cold and scared. He'd get her to the next town, and that would be the end of it. They drove on in silence, the rain hammering the windshield, the road stretching endlessly before them. As they continued, Jack tried to tune into the radio for company. The static hissed and crackled, but there was nothing. Frustrated, he turned the dial back and forth. Suddenly, a faint, whispery voice broke through the interference, barely audible over the static. "Don't stop for her." The words sent a chill down Jack's spine. He glanced at the radio, then at the woman beside him. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted at all. Her eyes remained fixed on the road, her expression blank. Jack shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Guess the radio's picking up interference from the storm." Still, the unease in his chest grew heavier. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the woman finally spoke. "This road, it's cursed." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Jack's skin crawl. He let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, I've heard stories. Old Route 66, right? People say it's haunted." The woman turned to him slowly, her eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. "It is." Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. When he glanced at her again, she had turned her attention back to the road, her expression unreadable. They drove in silence for another few miles before she spoke again. "People who don't help, they don't make it to the end." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Well, I'm helping you, aren't I?" She didn't respond, just stared at him with that same hollow gaze. For the first time in years, Jack felt genuinely afraid. Then, as he glanced back at the road, he saw it. The twisted wreckage of a truck lay in a heap just off the side of the road. His stomach twisted with dread as he slowed down, the headlights illuminating the mangled metal and shattered glass. It was his truck. He blinked, his mind racing. He hadn't had an accident. He was right here, driving. But the wreckage looked exactly like his truck, down to the dent on the side door. His heart pounded as he glanced over at the woman, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door slightly ajar, rainwater pooling on the leather. Jack's blood ran cold. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. He looked around, but there was no sign of her. She had vanished. Just then, the radio crackled to life and her voice filled the cab. "You left me to die, Jack," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. Jack felt trapped, his every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. Shadows shifted in the fog, shapes that grew clearer as they surrounded him. He saw his old friend Tony, who had died in a car accident years ago, his expression one of sorrow as he stared at Jack through the foggy windshield. He saw faces from his past, people he'd ignored, left behind. Each face bore a look of anger, hurt, and betrayal. "You abandoned us, Jack. You left us behind. Why did you do it, Jack?" Their voices blended into a cacophony of sorrow and accusation. Jack covered his ears, trying to block out their voices, but it was no use. The guilt consumed him, eating away at his sanity. He wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew it was too late. As he drove, he saw a sign up ahead, barely visible through the fog. He squinted, trying to make out the words, but they seemed to shift and blur before his eyes. "Welcome to nowhere." The words sent a chill through him, and he realized with a sense of dread that he was truly lost. This place wasn't on any map, wasn't part of any known world. It was a purgatory, a place where the souls of the damned were forced to wander, forever trapped in the mistakes of their past. The fog grew thicker and the headlights dimmed, barely illuminating the road. Shadows moved closer, their faces growing clearer, more distinct. He saw Lily, the woman he'd left on this very road years ago, her face pale and accusing as she stared at him through the mist. "Why did you leave me, Jack?" she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. I was afraid," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I thought I'd be safer if I didn't stop." Lily's face twisted with rage, her eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You left me to die, Jack. You thought only of yourself." Her words cut through him like a knife, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had been selfish, cowardly, and now he was paying the price. The fog thickened and the road seemed to twist and warp, leading him in endless circles. He drove on, unable to stop, his mind racing as he was forced to relive every mistake, every moment of weakness. Then the radio crackled, filling the cab with static, and he heard her voice once more, a final chilling command. "Drive, Jack. Keep driving. There's no turning back." The road stretched out before him, dark and unending, and in the mist he saw their faces, watching him, waiting. And Jack knew with a sinking certainty that he would be driving this cursed stretch of Route 66 forever, haunted by the souls he had abandoned. And as the rain continued to fall, Jack realized he was truly alone. Alone in the dark. Thank you for watching today's story. I hope these chilling experiences have made you reflect on fears and trust in life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on more engaging stories and interesting content in the future. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.